Morning light spilled like warm honey across the valley of Silverpine, gilding the forest's ancient redwoods in soft gold. In the heart of the village's communal garden, rows of bright marigolds and honeysuckle climbed lattice trellises, their petals quivering in the cool dawn breeze. Among the flowers darted Ember, a diminutive rufous hummingbird no larger than a walnut, her iridescent throat flashing copper in the early sun. Ember's day began as always, sipping nectar from the first blossoms to open, until a sharp, acrid tang cut through the sweet perfume of honeysuckle. She paused mid-hover, wings beating in a rapid blur of brown and bronze, antennae like feathers at the back of her head standing on end. Below her, old Mr. Hargrove leaned on his hoe, frowning at a curl of smoke that drifted beyond the garden fence, low on the eastern horizon. Ember darted forward, her tiny heart hammering. She spiraled above Mr. Hargrove's shock, then plunged toward the next bed of flowers, her beak dipping into each bloom, but missing the nectar entirely. Instead, she barely brushed the petals, stirring a tiny spray of pollen and with it, a chemical alarm signal, invisible to human eyes but potent among her own kind. Alarmed by the sudden cascade of pollen, a dozen hummingbirds burst from the trellis, scattering in sparkling arcs. The spectacle drew Mr. Hargrove's full attention. He dropped his hoe and shaded his eyes, staring as Ember rose again and zipped eastward, her song, a high, insistent trill, piercing the still air. Ember's chirp carried a note of urgency he'd never heard in the garden before. "By Jove!" he whispered, setting aside his rustic tools. He sprinted toward the bell tower that crowned the village square, calling for young Lila, the baker's apprentice, who was already lighting the furnace in the bakery. The other villagers stirred. Mrs. Nguyen peeked from her doorway, clay pot in hand. The blacksmith, Marcus, stepped from his forge, hammer still raised. As Ember shot over rooftops, her wings blurred into translucent crescents against the sky, she guided their gazes toward the east, where the smoke plume had risen into a thin vertical column, too slender yet unmistakable against dawn's pastel canvas. A hush fell over Silverpine's scattered cottages, an unspoken question trembling on every lip. Fire? Without hesitation, Mr. Hargrove rang the village bell with a single stentorian clang, an ancient signal for dire emergency. Ember darted around the belfry, its rungs echoing through the crisp air as more bell strokes followed. 2, 3, 4. The urgent peal summoned villagers from every corner. Farmers abandoned their plows, children fled clinging to fearful mothers, and Marcus the blacksmith secured his anvil with a heavy chain. Throughout it all, Ember hovered above the bell tower window, her tiny chest puffed in proud relief. Beyond the garden and the rooftops, the distant glow of embers flickered among the trees, an ominous promise that the forest's edge was aflame. As the final bell stroke faded into dawn's chorus, Ember dipped low and landed on the tower's ledge, ruffling her feathers. Below her, Silverpine stood ready, not because metal instruments had warned them, but because a single rufous hummingbird had sounded the first, most vital alarm. And in that moment, the village knew its smallest sentinel had become its greatest protector. Ember's tiny heart pounded like a drumbeat as she flitted eastward, the early morning calm shattered by the sharp tang of smoke. With each powerful wing beat, up to 80 strokes per second, she sliced through layers of swirling haze that clung to the valley's slopes. Below her, the once verdant pines at Silverpine's rim took on blotchy patterns of bronze and charcoal, their needles bristling in the rising heat. Ember flew low enough to catch their scent. Dry resin mingled with burning pitch, then angled upward, past the trembling crowns, driven by a single, urgent purpose. Halfway to the bell tower, Ember paused momentarily above a sun-baked clearing where last season's underbrush lay cracked and brittle. From a nearby blossom, she plucked a single honeysuckle petal, its throat still wet with nectar, and touched it gently with her beak, infusing it with the alarm pheromones she had stirred in the garden. Carefully gripping the petal in her tiny claws, she launched back into the smoky air, the petal's pungent warning riding the updraft behind her. As she approached the village's central plaza, a fierce gust swept down from the hills, whipping smoke and ash into stinging whirlwinds. Ember pressed her body close to the air currents, weaving deftly between gusts. Her wings, normally a muted blur of russet and gold, gleamed like polished copper in the sun's slanted rays. When the wind threatened to carry her off course, she angled her tail and shifted her flanks, aerial acrobatics that kept her on the narrow corridor between rooftops and power lines. The bell tower emerged through the veil of smoke, its weathered timbers darkened by years of sun and storm. Ember dove toward the narrow window just below the belfry, tapping the trembling petal against the sill. Below, the tower's keeper, Mr. Feldman, looked up from his perch, startled by the tiny creature's frantic gestures and the petal's pungent scent. She chirped a rapid, insistent call, her voice pitched higher than any human whistle, beckoning him to attend to the alarm before the bell even swung. Mr. Feldman's gnarled hand closed around the petal, and his eyes widened as he recognized its meaning. Setting aside his coffee, he climbed the narrow ladder 2 rungs at a time, each footfall echoing through the hollow tower. Ember circled his head, wings whirring as if conducting an urgent symphony. Reaching the bell's lever, Mr. Feldman hesitated only a moment, then yanked it with all his strength. The first stroke rang out, deep, sonorous, and insistent, long before the distant flames could breach the tree line. As the echo of that opening peal rolled across the rooftops, Ember hovered beside the clapper, her chest heaving but her spirit triumphant. She had braved heat-laden currents, scorching ash, and swirling winds to deliver her precious petal and her urgent message. Below, Silver Pine's villagers stirred to life, readying buckets and blankets, lumber and plows, united by a single vital truth. Their tiny fire alarm had sounded, and the battle to save their home had begun. The bell's urgent peal rippled over, Silver Pine like a shot of cold metal, echoing through winding lanes and hidden alleyways. From the bakery's open window, Celeste snatched up her flour-dusted apron and sprinted outside, kneading dough forgotten on the counter. Her nose twitched at the acrid smoke, and she joined neighbors assembling near the well, voices hushed in alarm. At the forge, Marcus the blacksmith slammed his hammer onto the anvil for the final time and set aside his tongs. Sparks hissed as the glowing iron cooled. Then he swept the embers into the hearth and grabbed his fire bucket. Across the square, Mrs. Nguyen clutched her infant's swaddling blanket, eyes wide, as she scooped up water basins to fill at the well. Even the children, Salt and Pepper twins Rosa and Luca, tugged at their father's sleeves, pleading for buckets to help. Below the bell tower window, Mr. Feldman peered out through the drifting ash. Ember hovered beside him, wings beating in quick staccato taps. The hummingbird's bright eyes darted toward the east, where the plume of smoke now roiled and thickened against the pale sky. Feldman waved the villagers forward. "To the ridge! Bring water, blankets, shovels, everything you can carry." A surge of determination rippled through the crowd. Men hoisted filled buckets, women tied cloths over every face, and children ran barefoot over dew-slimed grass, carrying pails and small sacks of grain. Together they formed a ragged column that wound up the gentle slope toward the redwood ridge. Ember led the way, darting ahead to scout the path, perching on low branches to survey potential fire breaks, and chirping at intervals to guide the villagers around smoldering patches of underbrush. Higher on the ridge, tree trunks cracked and groaned as embers nestled deep within hollow burls, ignited. Marcus knelt beside a nascent flame, dousing it with buckets of water hauled from the well. Celeste and Mrs. Nguyen passed gallons down the line, forming a human chain that sent waves of water cascading over burning detritus. Rosa and Luca beat the ground with small branches, stamped out drifting sparks before they could catch. All the while, Ember flitted anxiously, fluttering above knotty roots and pointing her beak toward the densest smoke. When a hidden ember burst into flame beneath a fern bank, Ember dove low, her wings stirring a breeze that carried the smoke away from startled villagers, granting them just enough time to smother the fire. As the sun climbed higher, the villagers paused on the ridge crest, shoulders heaving, faces smudged with ash and sweat. Before them lay the valley, the plume now a blazing column, but their line of defense held firm. Ember alighted atop Marcus's broad shoulder, nestling her tiny frame against his soot-darkened coat. In that quiet moment of hard-won vigilance, the village realized they stood not only protected by their own courage, but by the smallest sentinel whose tiny wings had warned them in time. The acrid stench of smoke thickened as Silver Pine's villagers pressed up the narrow track toward the fire breaks on Redwood Ridge. Ember led the way, her flight now a precise zigzag just above the line of fleeing families, her wings beating a staccato warning against the rising roar behind them. Each wing beat kicked up fine ash, tracing a glowing ribbon through the gloom. Celeste lugged 2 full buckets of well water, her coat streaked with soot, while Marcus hauled a battered wheelbarrow laden with shovels and wet burlap sacks. Behind them, children clutched mothers' hands, their eyes wide with fear and determination. Ember dipped low over every straggler, a stooped grandmother pausing for breath. the village smith's apprentice nursing a twisted ankle, her rapid chirps urging them onward. Midway up the ridge, a sudden gust bore down from the fire's edge, sending embers swirling like sparks from a furnace. A smoldering twig fell at Marcus's feet and teetered over the path's edge. Without hesitation, he stamped it out, then tossed the heel of his boot at another spark on a fern crown. Ember hovered overhead, her tiny body quivering with urgency as she circled the danger zone 3 times, then led the group around a safer route beneath a stand of young cedars. At the granary, a squat, weather-beaten building whose thick stone walls had sheltered generations, Ember settled onto the ridge-sloped roof tiles, her chest heaving. Below, the final families emerged from the trail's last hairpin turn. The Baker's twins, Rosa and Luca, each carrying a dripping bucket. Mrs. Nguyen with her arm threaded through her husband's, and old Mr. Hargrove, who leaned heavily on a sharpened branch as a makeshift walking stick. Ember's bright cry sliced through the smoke as she hopped to the edge of the granary's wide eaves, tapping the roof twice with her tail before chirping toward the cliffside firebreak. The villagers understood. Beyond the granary lay a narrow plateau, their safest refuge. They formed a tight cluster, shoulders squared, and marched in Ember's wake across the chinking stones of the granary's threshold and onto the plateau's firmer ground. Behind them, the Wildfire's lead edge struck the lower ridge with a shriek of snapping trees and a crackling wall of flames. The villagers worked swiftly, Marcus and Celeste stacking soaked burlap along the ridge's lip, Mr. Hargrove dousing smoldering stumps, and mothers forming bucket lines to pour water into the new firebreak trenches. Ember darted among them, her tiny form a blur of copper, and each time a wayward ember drifted too close, she chased it off with sharp, insistent trills that drew a human boot to stomp it out. By the time the sun broke through the smoke in a pale, trembling arc, Silverpine's firefighters, rangers in heavy gear, surged up the track, hoses at the ready. They found the ridge secure, the villagers assembled on the plateau, and Ember perched triumphantly atop the granary's stone cornice, surveying the valley below with bright, watchful eyes. In that moment of calm, each resident of Silverpine understood that they owed their lives not only to their own grit and buckets of water, but to the swift wings and fiery heart of the tiniest sentinel, the Hummingbird, that raced them to safety when every second counted. By late afternoon, the Wildfire's roar had receded to a distant thunder, and Silverpine's ridge lay smoldering under a haze of copper-tinted light. Ash drifted through the sky like snow, settling on scorched ferns and blackened duff. Yet on the village green, once a patchwork of daffodils and honeysuckle, families gathered in ragged clusters, their faces bright with relief. Ember, the rufous hummingbird, darted among them, her wings a blur of gleaming copper against the gray backdrop. The villagers had reclaimed their homes. Marcus the blacksmith hammered new iron bars into the forge's windows, while Celeste kneaded fresh loaves of rosemary bread for every family. Children chased each other among the drifts of ash, their laughter a defiant hymn against the destruction. Mrs. Nguyen distributed cups of cool mint tea, soothing scorched throats and parched smiles, and old Mr. Hargrove led the village choir in a quiet hymn of gratitude. Ember flitted to the charred fence encircling the garden, where a single honeysuckle sprig still clung to life. She sipped the last drop of its nectar, then perched on a nearby post, her tiny silhouette a symbol of hope amid the ruin. A small child approached, her hands cupped around a fresh blossom offered as a gift. Ember accepted it with a gentle peck, then fluttered toward the village bell tower. Above, Mr. Feldman prepared to toll the bell once more. Not an alarm this time, but a ceremonial peal to mark Silverpine's survival. Ember hovered at the window as he pulled the lever. The bell's rich tones rolled across the valley, weaving through the redwoods and echoing against the distant hills. With each reverberation, the villagers laid down their tools and rose, heads lifted and hearts unified. Sergeant Lee Harding, passing through on his forest fire patrol, paused at the edge of the green. He watched as Ember circled the bell tower 3 times, an ancient code among hummingbirds for celebration, and then descended to alight on Lee's outstretched hand. The energy of her rapid heartbeat pulsed through his glove as he offered a respectful nod. In her tiny chest, he felt the courage that had saved a village. As dusk deepened, lanterns were lit along the pathways, casting a warm glow over fresh footprints in the ash. Ember made one final circuit of the green, dipping close to every face as though offering a benediction. Then, with a blur of amber feathers, she vanished into the twilight, leaving behind only the sweet scent of honeysuckle and a village forever changed by its tiniest guardian. In the days that followed, Silverpine honored Ember's bravery with a festival of blooms. Each spring thereafter, villagers planted new honeysuckle beds and redwood saplings along the ridge, living monuments to the hummingbird fire alarm who had warned them in time. And every dawn, the oldest among them would pause at the garden gate, listening for a tiny trill on the breeze, remembering the day a wisp of wings carried their lives from the flames.